The fluorescent lights of mess hall. Charlie at Camp Pendleton buzzed like angry hornets, casting their harsh glare over rows of metal tables where Marines hunched over their evening chow. The air was thick with the smell of industrial-grade meatloaf, cigarette smoke drifting in from the smoking area, and the particular musk of men who believed they owned every square inch of ground they walked on. What happened next would shatter that belief in ways none of them could imagine. When Marine Corporal Jake Thornton grabbed a fistful of auburn hair belonging to a woman he assumed was just another weak link in their chain of command. He had no idea he'd just assaulted Commander Sarah Mitchell, the newly assigned leader of SEAL Team 7, a woman whose kill count in 3 combat deployments exceeded his entire units combined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mess hall sat at the heart of Marine Corps Base Oceanside, where the Pacific breeze carried the salt tang of endless water and the echo of drill sergeants molding boys into warriors. It was a temple to military hierarchy, where rank meant everything and respect was earned through blood, sweat, and the ability to break things efficiently. Tonight, like every night, it was packed with Marines who wore their arrogance like body armor, thick, protective, and completely impenetrable to reason. At the center table, surrounded by his usual crew of sycophants and wannabes, sat Staff Sergeant Rex Donovan. At 34, he was a recruiting poster brought to life. Square jaw, shoulders that could carry the weight of democracy itself, and eyes like chips of granite. His uniform was pressed to perfection, his boots polished to a mirror shine, his bearing that of a man who'd never met a problem he couldn't solve, with superior firepower and unwavering conviction. The Marines around him hung on his every word like gospel truth. Donovan commanded Bravo Company's most elite unit, or so he told anyone who'd listen. They were force reconnaissance specialists, the tip of the spear, the finest warriors America could forge from raw clay and determination. They'd completed tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, earned their combat ribbons the hard way, and returned home with the kind of swagger that only came from surviving hell and living to brag about it. But look closer, past the polished surface and practiced bravado, and you'd see the cracks. Donovan's hands shook slightly when he thought nobody was watching. Too much coffee or something stronger, who could say? His eyes were bloodshot, whether from exhaustion or the bottle he kept in his footlocker was anyone's guess. Most telling of all, there was a desperate edge to his confidence, the kind that came from a man who knew his glory days were behind him and was terrified of becoming irrelevant. To his right sat Corporal Jake Thornton, 26 years old, but carrying himself like he owned the world. Built like a linebacker with hands the size of dinner plates, he was the unit's self-appointed enforcer, the one they called when someone needed an attitude adjustment. His knuckles bore the permanent discoloration of a man who'd settled too many arguments with violence, and his smile never quite reached his eyes. He'd washed out of Ranger School twice, not for lack of physical capability, but because he couldn't follow orders from anyone he didn't respect. That failure had calcified into a resentment he wore like a badge of honor. Across from Thornton sat Lance Corporal Danny Cruz, 23 and hungry for acceptance, in a way that made him dangerous. He was lean where Thornton was thick, quick where the others were methodical, smart where they were strong. The unit's communications specialist, he could make dead radios sing and had a mind sharp enough to have earned a full scholarship to MIT, which he'd turned down to enlist because he wanted to prove himself where it really mattered. His need for validation made him eager to please, willing to cross lines others might hesitate at. Completing their inner circle was Private First Class Mike Sullivan, the youngest at 24, still carrying that desperate hunger of a man trying to prove he belonged. fresh out of advanced infantry training with scores high enough to write his own ticket. He'd requested assignment to Bravo Company specifically because of their reputation. He stood at attention even while sitting, his back ramrod straight, his eyes constantly scanning for approval from the older Marines. In his mind, earning their respect was the key to everything: promotion, respect, belonging to something bigger than himself. The mess hall operated on unwritten rules as rigid as any military regulation. Officers sat separately from enlisted. Senior NCOs commanded the prime real estate near the windows. Junior Marines filled in the spaces left behind, grateful for whatever scraps of recognition filtered down from above. Women, the few who were stationed at Oceanside, kept to their own corner, a safety measure born of bitter experience with Marines who saw them as invaders in their sacred brotherhood. Tonight felt different, though. Word had been circulating through the grapevine that changes were coming to their corner of military paradise. Budget cuts, personnel transfers, maybe even unit reorganizations that could scatter Donovan's carefully cultivated kingdom to the four winds. The tension was thick enough to cut with a KA bar, and everyone was looking for someone to blame, someone to take their frustrations out on. That's when she walked in. The woman who entered moved with an economy of motion that suggested absolute confidence in her environment. She was maybe 5'7", athletic build, visible even under the loose-fitting utility uniform she wore. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a regulation ponytail, and her green eyes swept the room with the kind of systematic assessment that marked her as someone accustomed to reading hostile environments. She carried a simple metal tray and moved toward the serving line like she belonged there, like she had every right to share their space. She wore no visible rank insignia. Her uniform was Navy issue, but the patches had been removed, leaving only faint outlines where they had once been attached. To the casual observer, she looked like a civilian contractor, maybe a Pentagon liaison, possibly even a reporter doing a story on military life. Someone temporary, someone who didn't matter, someone who definitely didn't belong in their sacred space. Donovan noticed her first, his eyes narrowing as he took in her presence. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and watched her move through the serving line with the kind of predatory attention that made smart people nervous. The woman seemed oblivious to his scrutiny, focused on the simple task of getting food and finding a place to eat. "Well, well," Donovan said, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard at the surrounding tables. "Looks like we've got ourselves a lost little lamb." Thornton followed his sergeant's gaze and grinned, the expression holding all the warmth of a shark's smile. "Pentagon send us a babysitter, Sarge? Someone to make sure we're playing nice with our toys?" The woman found an empty table in the corner, sat down alone, and began eating with the methodical efficiency of someone who viewed food as fuel rather than pleasure. She seemed completely unaware of the attention she was drawing, the conversations stopping at nearby tables, the way Marines were beginning to turn in their chairs to get a better look at the intruder. Cruz leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. $20 says she's some admiral's daughter getting the grand tour before Daddy retires. 50 says she's a social worker, Sullivan added, his young face flushed with the excitement of being included in the speculation. Here to investigate hazing complaints or sensitivity training violations. Donovan's smile was cold and calculating. In his mind, this was an opportunity, a chance to reassert the natural order, to remind everyone present that this was his domain and outsiders weren't welcome. More importantly, it was a chance to demonstrate to his Marines that he was still the alpha, still the man they should fear and respect above all others. The stage was set. The hierarchy was established. The players were in position. None of them had any idea that the quiet woman eating alone in the corner had more combat experience than their entire unit combined. that her kill count included high-value targets they'd only heard whispered about in intelligence briefings, that she could end any three of them without breaking a sweat. They were about to learn that assumptions could be more dangerous than enemy fire, and Corporal Jake Thornton was about to make the biggest mistake of his military career. Commander Sarah Mitchell had walked into hostile territory before, Fallujah safe houses where insurgents waited behind every door, Afghan mountain caves where Taliban fighters had the high ground and home field advantage, Syrian compounds where one wrong step meant death for her entire team. But none of those environments had prepared her for the peculiar brand of toxicity that permeated Mess Hall Charlie at 1900 hours on a Tuesday night. She'd arrived at Marine Corps Base Oceanside 3 hours earlier, her orders sealed and her mission classified, at levels that would make most of these jarheads' security clearances look like library cards. The official story was simple: joint training exercise, inter-service cooperation, Navy-Marine Corps integration. The reality was considerably more complex and infinitely more dangerous, but that wasn't something these Marines needed to know. Not yet. Sarah had requested this assignment specifically against the advice of her superiors, who'd warned her that Marines didn't play well with outsiders, especially outsiders who happened to be female, Navy, and carrying enough classified intelligence to end careers. But she'd insisted, and when a SEAL team commander insisted on something, admirals tended to listen. She had her reasons, good reasons that went back 6 months to an operation in Somalia that had gone sideways because Marine intelligence had been compromised by the same kind of institutional arrogance she was witnessing right now. Her uniform bore no rank insignia by design. The mission required her to assess unit cohesion, leadership effectiveness, and operational readiness without the artificial deference that came with visible rank. She needed to see these Marines as they really were, not as they pretended to be when brass was watching. The early results were not encouraging. She'd chosen a table in the corner deliberately, good sight lines to all entrances, back to the wall, clear fields of fire if things went kinetic. Old habits from a decade of operations where complacency killed and situational awareness meant the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. The metal chair was uncomfortable, the lighting harsh, but she'd endured worse, much worse. The food was exactly what she'd expected from a military facility, institutional, functional, designed more for caloric content than palatability. She ate with mechanical efficiency, one eye on her meal and one on the room's dynamics. Already she was cataloging personalities, identifying power structures, noting the subtle ways that dominance and submission played out in something as simple as seating arrangements. Staff Sergeant Donovan's table was clearly the apex of the local food chain. The way other Marines glanced over, seeking approval or acknowledgement, marked him as the unofficial king of this particular castle. His body language screamed confidence, but Sarah's trained eye caught the micro-tells that suggested a man under pressure. The slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes darted toward the entrance every time someone new arrived, the tension in his jaw that spoke of grinding teeth and sleepless nights. Corporal Thornton was easier to read, a classic alpha personality with impulse control issues and an authority complex. She'd seen his type before in every branch of service, competent enough to be dangerous, insecure enough to overcompensate, and stupid enough to mistake aggression for strength. The way he kept glancing in her direction suggested he was already formulating some kind of challenge, testing boundaries that he didn't realize existed. The younger Marines, Cruz and Sullivan, were followers, pack animals looking for a strong leader to validate their place in the hierarchy, dangerous in their own way because their need for acceptance would make them willing participants in whatever stupidity their seniors conceived. She'd seen good soldiers do terrible things simply because they wanted to belong. What troubled her most was the complete absence of professional curiosity. Not one of these Marines had approached her, introduced himself, or made any attempt to determine her purpose on their base. Basic security protocol demanded that unidentified personnel be challenged, credentials verified, authority established. Instead, they'd made assumptions based on her gender and apparent lack of visible rank, then proceeded to ignore her as irrelevant. It was exactly the kind of institutional blindness that had gotten Marines killed in Somalia. Sarah finished her meal and checked her watch. 19-20 hours. She had a briefing with the base commander at 2100, which gave her another hour and 40 minutes to complete her initial assessment. So far, the picture wasn't pretty. Sloppy security awareness, poor discipline, and leadership that seemed more concerned with maintaining social dominance than military effectiveness. She pulled out a small notebook, government issue, nothing fancy, and began making discreet notes, not about what she was seeing, but about what she wasn't seeing. No senior NCOs visible in the mess hall during prime dinner hours. No officers mixing with enlisted personnel. No evidence of the kind of unit cohesion that marked elite military formations. Just cliques and posturing and the kind of toxic masculinity that turned warriors into playground bullies. The conversation at Donovan's table was getting louder, more animated. She caught fragments of discussion, complaints about new regulations, speculation about upcoming deployments, crude jokes about female personnel, standard barracks talk, but delivered with an edge that suggested these men felt entitled to their opinions and unconcerned about who might be listening. Thornton's voice carried particularly well, probably by design. He was the type who needed an audience for his performance, validation for his dominance. Sarah had encountered his breed before in every combat zone she'd operated in. Men who confused volume with authority and intimidation with leadership. They were usually the first to break when real pressure was applied. "I'm telling you," Thornton was saying, his voice pitched to carry, "these diversity initiatives are going to get people killed. You can't lower standards just to make politicians feel good about themselves." Murmurs of agreement from his audience. Cruz nodded enthusiastically. Sullivan looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. Donovan leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a man watching his disciples spread his gospel. Sarah continued eating, continued taking notes, continued cataloging the dozens of ways these Marines were failing basic professional standards. She'd seen this movie before, knew how it ended. The only question was whether she'd need to accelerate the timeline or let their natural stupidity run its course. That's when Thornton made his first tactical error. He stood up from his table, ostensibly to clear his tray, but his path took him directly past Sarah's corner table. Not a coincidence, the serving line and disposal area were in the opposite direction. This was a deliberate maneuver, a probing action designed to test her reaction and establish his dominance of the space. Sarah didn't look up from her notebook, didn't acknowledge his presence, didn't give him the confrontation he was clearly seeking. In her experience, men like Thornton escalated when ignored, revealed their true nature when they thought nobody important was watching. Thornton paused beside her table, close enough that his shadow fell across her notes. Still, she didn't react, just continued writing in the small, precise handwriting that had filled dozens of after-action reports over the years. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his tone superficially polite but carrying an undertone of condescension. "I don't think we've been introduced." Now Sarah looked up, meeting his eyes with the kind of level stare that had made insurgent leaders reconsider their life choices. "No," she said simply, "we haven't." The silence stretched out, filled with potential energy like the moment before lightning strikes. Thornton had expected elaboration, Explanation, the kind of nervous chatter that uncertain people use to fill uncomfortable spaces. Instead, he got nothing, just green eyes that seemed to see right through his carefully constructed facade. "I'm Corporal Thornton," he said, extending his hand. "Bravo Company Force Recon, and you are?" Sarah looked at his outstretched hand for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to be noticeable, short enough to avoid outright rudeness. Then she returned to her notebook without accepting the gesture. "Busy," she said. The word hit Thornton like a physical blow. Around the mess hall, conversations had stopped as Marines tuned in to the drama playing out in the corner. This wasn't how these encounters were supposed to go. He was Force Recon. He was Alpha. He was supposed to command respect and deference, not get dismissed like some boot private. His face flushed red above his collar, and Sarah could see the moment his rational mind yielded to his emotional need for dominance. This was where it would start, the first step in a chain of escalating stupidity that would ultimately reveal everything she needed to know about this unit's fitness for classified operations. "Look, lady," Thornton said, his voice dropping to a register that was meant to be threatening. "I don't know who you are or why you're here, but this is a Marine facility. We have protocols, procedures, ways of doing things. Maybe you're lost. Maybe you're in the wrong building. Maybe you need an escort back to wherever you're supposed to be." Sarah finished writing her sentence, capped her pen, and looked up at him again. This time her expression held a hint of amusement, the kind of patient tolerance you might show a particularly slow child. "Corporal," she said, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard at the surrounding tables, "do you always introduce yourself to visitors by assuming they're lost and offering to escort them off base?" It was a perfect trap, beautifully constructed. If he backed down now, he'd look weak in front of his audience. If he escalated, he'd be taking action against an unidentified individual without proper authority or justification. Either choice would reveal critical information about his judgment, his training, and his fitness for leadership. Thornton chose escalation. His hand moved toward her shoulder, ostensibly to guide her to her feet, actually to establish physical dominance through uninvited contact. It was a move that had worked for him before with civilians, contractors, and junior personnel who understood their place in the food chain. He had no idea that the woman sitting quietly in the corner had spent the last 10 years perfecting the art of violence, that her hands were classified as lethal weapons by 3 different government agencies, that touching her without permission was about to become the most expensive mistake of his military career. Sarah's eyes went cold, and for just a moment, Thornton caught a glimpse of something that made his survival instincts scream warnings his pride refused to hear. The collision was about to begin. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but every Marine in mess hall, Charlie would remember it for the rest of their lives, with the kind of crystal clarity reserved for car crashes and combat engagements. Corporal Jake Thornton's hand was 6 inches from Sarah's shoulder when the world shifted on its axis and taught him the difference between confidence and competence. Sarah didn't move like other people moved. There was no wasted motion, no telegraphed intention, no warning signs that her body was about to become a weapon. One moment she was sitting quietly with her notebook. The next she was flowing upward like water taking the shape of violence. Her left hand intercepted Thornton's wrist with surgical precision, fingers finding the pressure point where the radial nerve surfaced just below his thumb joint. The contact lasted exactly 1 second, long enough to send white-hot agony shooting up his arm, not long enough for him to process what was happening. But that wasn't the lesson. The lesson came when Thornton tried to pull back, tried to reassert his physical dominance through superior size and strength. Sarah let him pull, encouraged it even, using his own momentum against him in a way that turned his retreat into forward motion. Her right hand appeared at his elbow, not grabbing, just guiding, redirecting his energy along vectors that his body understood but his brain couldn't comprehend. Physics took over. Thornton's center of gravity shifted forward, his weight committed to a direction he hadn't chosen. Sarah stepped aside like a matador avoiding a bull, and suddenly the big Marine was airborne, his trajectory carrying him past her table and towards the concrete floor with all the grace of a falling refrigerator. He hit hard, shoulder first, then hip, then the side of his face, in a sequence that sounded like someone dropping a sack of potatoes from a significant height. The silence that followed was absolute. 37 Marines sat frozen in their chairs, forks halfway to their mouths, conversations interrupted mid-syllable. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their clattering to stare through the serving window at the impossible sight of Jake Thornton, 6'2", 220 pounds of Marine Corps muscle, sprawled on the floor while a woman who couldn't weigh more than 140 stood over him like she'd just swatted a mosquito. Thornton rolled onto his back, blinking stars out of his vision, his right arm hanging useless at his side. The nerve strike had been precisely calculated, painful enough to disable, not quite severe enough to cause permanent damage. He tried to push himself up with his left hand, failed, tried again. His face was a mask of shock, humiliation, and dawning rage. "What the hell?" he started to say. "Physics," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. She hadn't even sat back down, just stood beside her table with the same relaxed posture she'd maintained throughout the entire encounter. "Action, reaction. You grabbed, I redirected. Basic Newtonian mechanics." She looked down at him with the kind of patient expression usually reserved for particularly slow students. "Also, personal space, Corporal. Generally speaking, you don't touch people without permission, especially people you don't know. Especially when those people are sitting quietly, eating their dinner, minding their own business." Staff Sergeant Donovan was on his feet now, his chair scraping backward with enough force to tip it over. His face had gone through several interesting color changes, pale to red to purple, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. The careful control he'd maintained over his domain was cracking like ice in a spring thaw. "Who the hell do you think you are?" His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to instant obedience, the kind of barely controlled fury that made smart Marines find somewhere else to be. "You just assaulted one of my Marines." Sarah turned to face him, and Donovan got his first good look at those green eyes. They were calm, professional, completely unmoved by his display of authority. It was like staring into the eyes of a shark. Not malevolent, just utterly indifferent to anything that wasn't prey. "Your Marine assaulted me, Sergeant," she said. "I defended myself using the minimum force necessary to terminate unwanted physical contact. That's textbook self-defense doctrine, covered in Section 4 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice." She paused, letting that sink in. Around the mess hall, Marines were beginning to murmur among themselves, phones appearing as word spread through the modern military's most efficient communication network. Social media. This was going to be all over base within an hour, probably all over the Corps within a day. "Unless," Sarah continued, "you're suggesting that your Marines should be permitted to grab female personnel without consequence? Is that standard operating procedure for Bravo Company?" The question hung in the air like a live grenade, with the pin pulled. Donovan's mouth opened, closed, opened again. He was caught between contradictory imperatives: defend his Marine versus avoid a sexual harassment investigation that would end his career. The smart play was to de-escalate, apologize for the misunderstanding, move on. But Donovan hadn't made sergeant by being smart. He'd made it by being tough, and toughness demanded a response. Lady, I don't know what kind of games you think you're playing, but this is a Marine Corps facility. We have procedures here, protocols. You can't just... Can't just what? Sarah's voice remained level, conversational. Can't just sit in your mess hall. Can't just eat a meal. Can't just exist in a space you've decided belongs exclusively to you. Thornton was back on his feet now, cradling his right arm against his chest. His face was flushed with embarrassment and fury, his breathing rapid and shallow. The fall had rattled him more than just physically. It had shattered his self-image as an alpha predator and replaced it with the humiliating reality of being prey. "You sucker punched me," he said, his voice tight with pain and wounded pride. "That was a cheap shot, a fluke." Sarah's smile was winter cold. "Corporal, if I wanted to sucker punch you, you'd still be unconscious. What you experienced was a compliance technique designed to disengage unwanted physical contact. It's the same move they teach to elementary school children in anti-bullying programs." The comparison to elementary school children was calculated, deliberate, designed to probe just how far Thornton's ego would let him fall before common sense reasserted itself. The answer, apparently, was much farther than anyone had expected. "Compliance technique?" Thornton's laugh was ugly, bitter. "You think you're some kind of martial arts expert? You think one lucky move makes you tough?" He rolled his shoulders, cracked his neck, settled into a fighting stance that would have been intimidating if Sarah hadn't already demonstrated her ability to take him apart. Around the mess hall, Marines were pulling out their phones, sensing that whatever was about to happen would be worth recording. "Tell you what, lady," Thornton continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "You apologize for that cheap shot, and I'll forget this ever happened. We'll call it a misunderstanding. No harm, no foul." Sarah looked at him with the kind of clinical interest usually reserved for interesting specimens. "And if I don't apologize?" Thornton's grin was all teeth and no warmth. "Then maybe you need to learn some respect for Marines in general, and me in particular." It was a threat, clear and unambiguous, delivered in front of 36 witnesses. Sarah cataloged it, filed it away with all the other evidence she was accumulating about this unit's fitness for classified operations. The picture wasn't getting any prettier. "Corporal," she said, "are you challenging me to a fight?" The question was asked with such matter-of-fact calm that it took a moment for its implications to sink in. Thornton's bravado faltered slightly as his tactical brain finally came online and started calculating odds. She'd already put him on the floor once without apparent effort. She was smaller, lighter, presumably weaker, but something about the way she stood suggested that conventional assumptions might not apply. "I'm suggesting," he said carefully, "that maybe you bit off more than you can chew." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I see. So to be clear, you grabbed me without permission. I extracted myself using minimal force, and now you want to escalate to an actual physical confrontation because your feelings are hurt." Put that way, it sounded exactly as stupid as it was. Thornton's face darkened further, but he'd committed too much pride to back down now. Around the mess hall, Marines were choosing sides, placing bets, preparing for what promised to be either the most entertaining or most embarrassing 5 minutes in recent base history. "You know what?" Sarah said, sitting back down at her table with fluid grace. "I'm good. You've already demonstrated everything I needed to know about your judgment, your training, and your fitness for leadership. Thanks for the data point." She picked up her pen and returned to her notebook, apparently dismissing the entire encounter as beneath her notice. It was the perfect psychological manipulation, offering Thornton a face-saving exit while simultaneously demonstrating her complete lack of concern about his capacity for violence. Thornton stood there for a long moment, fists clenched, breathing hard, every muscle in his body screaming for action while his brain slowly processed the tactical situation. He could walk away, accept the implied insult, and preserve what remained of his dignity. Or he could escalate further and risk discovering exactly how badly he'd misjudged the quiet woman in the corner. The entire mess hall held its breath, waiting to see which version of Jake Thornton would emerge from this crucible, the smart one or the stupid one. Unfortunately for everyone involved, stupid won. His hand shot out toward her ponytail, fingers grasping for auburn hair, intending to jerk her head back and establish physical dominance through the kind of playground tactics that had worked for him since elementary school. What happened next would redefine everyone's understanding of the word mistake. Corporal Jake Thornton's fingers had barely grazed Sarah's ponytail when the world exploded into motion and pain. What followed wasn't a fight. Fights implied some degree of mutual participation, a back-and-forth exchange where both parties had at least a theoretical chance of victory. This was a clinic, a masterclass in applied violence delivered with the kind of surgical precision that turned human anatomy into a series of pressure points, leverage opportunities, and structural weaknesses waiting to be exploited. Sarah's response was instantaneous and devastating. Her body uncoiled from the chair like a compressed spring suddenly released, rotating counterclockwise as her right elbow drove backward into Thornton's solar plexus with piledriver force. The blow landed exactly where her anatomy textbook knowledge told her it would do maximum damage, just below the sternum, directly into the cluster of nerves that controlled his diaphragm. The air exploded from his lungs in a sound like a punctured tire, and his brain's autonomic systems went haywire, forgetting how to make his body breathe. But Sarah wasn't finished with him. Not even close. As Thornton doubled over, gasping like a landed fish, Sarah's left hand captured his wrist, the same hand that had grabbed for her hair, and applied a joint lock that turned his own momentum into a lever against his shoulder socket. The technique was called kimura in martial arts circles, though Sarah had learned it in considerably less civilized circumstances, from instructors who measured success in enemy casualties rather than tournament victories. The lock engaged with mechanical precision. Thornton's shoulder joint reached its maximum range of motion, then kept going, ligaments stretching past their design parameters. Pain shot down his arm like molten copper, and he tried to pull away, which only made everything worse. Sarah controlled the pressure with surgical precision, enough to incapacitate, not quite enough to cause permanent damage. Professional courtesy, she supposed, though he'd done nothing to earn it. "The human shoulder," Sarah said conversationally, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence of the mess hall, "is a remarkably complex joint. 26 separate muscles, 4 major ligament groups, and a range of motion that makes it incredibly versatile but structurally vulnerable." She adjusted her grip slightly, and Thornton made a sound like a wounded animal. His face had gone pale, sweat beading on his forehead as his nervous system tried to process more pain than it was designed to handle. Around the mess hall, Marines sat frozen, phones recording, witnessing something that would be analyzed and discussed and mythologized for years to come. "For instance," Sarah continued, applying fractionally more pressure, "if I rotate your arm just 3 degrees further in this direction, your shoulder dislocates. 6 degrees and the rotator cuff tears. 9 degrees and you're looking at reconstructive surgery and 18 months of physical therapy." Thornton tried to speak, managed only a strangled wheeze. His face was turning interesting colors as his respiratory system slowly remembered how to function. Sarah held the lock for exactly 5 seconds, long enough to demonstrate complete control, not long enough to cause lasting damage. then released him with a casual motion that sent him stumbling backward into an empty chair. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Thornton's ragged breathing and the distant hum of the kitchen ventilation system. 37 Marines stared at the impossible scene before them, their unit's toughest fighter reduced to a gasping, sweating mess by a woman who looked like she'd barely exerted herself. Staff Sergeant Donovan's face had cycled through the entire spectrum of human emotion and settled somewhere between rage and disbelief. His world, the carefully constructed hierarchy where Marines sat at the apex of military evolution, was crumbling before his eyes, and he seemed powerless to stop it. "That's enough," he said, his voice cracking like a whip across the mess hall. "I don't know who you think you are, lady, but you just assaulted 2 of my Marines. That's a criminal offense. Military police are going to be very interested in hearing about this." Sarah looked at him with the kind of patient tolerance usually reserved for particularly slow children. "Sergeant, your Marine grabbed my hair without permission. That's assault. I defended myself using appropriate force. Everything that happened after that was his choice to escalate." She gestured toward Thornton, who was slowly regaining his ability to breathe normally but still looked like he'd been hit by a truck. "I gave him multiple opportunities to disengage. I offered clear verbal warnings. He chose violence. I simply responded more efficiently than he expected." Donovan's hands were clenched into fists, his jaw working like he was chewing nails. Around him, his Marines were beginning to murmur among themselves, phones buzzing with messages as word spread through the base's social networks. This was going viral, and everyone knew it. "You think this is funny?" Donovan snarled. "You think you can come into my mess hall, assault my Marines, and walk away like nothing happened?" "Your mess hall?" Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's interesting, Sergeant. I was under the impression this was a United States Marine Corps facility, open to all authorized personnel. When did it become your personal kingdom?" The question hit its target with sniper rifle precision. Donovan's face flushed red above his collar, and Sarah could see the moment his rational mind yielded completely to his emotional need for dominance. This was what she'd been waiting for, the point where professional training gave way to personal ego, where a leader revealed whether he was actually fit to lead or just good at intimidating subordinates. "You want to know whose kingdom this is?" Donovan stepped closer, using his height and bulk as weapons of intimidation. "Let me explain how things work around here. This is Bravo Company. These are my Marines. And you," he pointed a thick finger at her face, "are nobody. A civilian contractor, maybe a Pentagon desk jockey, probably some admiral's diversity hire who thinks a weekend self-defense class makes her a warrior." Sarah didn't react to the finger in her face, didn't step back, didn't show any of the submissive body language that Donovan's psychology demanded. She just looked at him with those green eyes that seemed to see right through his bluster to the insecure man beneath. "You're right about one thing, Sergeant," she said quietly. "I am nobody. Just someone trying to eat dinner in peace before I brief your commanding officer on inter-service cooperation protocols." The mention of the commanding officer should have been a warning, a signal that she had official business and authority to be there. Instead, it seemed to inflame Donovan's paranoia further. In his mind, she was probably there to spy on them, to find fault with their operations, to threaten the little empire he'd built through years of intimidation and politics. "Brief the CO about what?" His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "About how my Marines need sensitivity training? About how we're all sexist pigs who can't handle strong women? About how the Corps needs to lower its standards to accommodate people who can't hack it?" Around the mess hall, conversations had stopped completely. Even the kitchen staff had emerged to watch the confrontation, Sensing that something significant was happening, Marines pulled out phones, started recording. Whatever happened next would be preserved forever, dissected and analyzed and shared across every military social media platform. Lance Corporal Cruz found his voice first, emboldened by his sergeant's obvious anger. "Ma'am, maybe you should just leave. This doesn't have to get any worse than it already is." Sarah turned to look at him, and Cruz felt a chill run down his spine. Those eyes were absolutely cold, the kind of empty calm that predators wore just before they struck. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost gentle, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. "Worse, Corporal? You think this is bad?" She gestured around the mess hall, at the Marines recording with their phones, at Thornton still gasping in his chair. "This is just a conversation between professionals, a learning opportunity." She stood up from her table, moving with that same fluid grace that had characterized everything she'd done since walking into their world. The motion was simple, unthreatening, but something about it made every Marine in the room tense up as if a switch had been thrown. "See, here's what I think happened," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "I think you boys got comfortable. You've been operating in your little bubble, playing soldier, convincing yourselves that you're warriors because you've got the uniforms and the attitude and the swagger." She took a step toward Donovan, who, despite being 6 inches taller and 60 pounds heavier, actually took a half step back before catching himself. "But warriors aren't made in mess halls, Sergeant. They're made in places where mistakes cost lives, where hesitation means death, where your assumptions about who belongs and who doesn't become irrelevant really quickly when the bullets start flying." Her smile was winter cold. "You want to know who I am? You want to know why I'm here? Fine. But understand that once I tell you, once this conversation moves to its logical conclusion, there's no going back. Your comfortable little world where you're the apex predators, that ends tonight." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Donovan could back down, apologize for the misunderstanding, accept that maybe, just maybe, he'd misjudged the situation entirely, or he could double down on his authority, his pride, his absolute certainty that Marines were superior to everyone else in the military hierarchy. Looking at his face, Sarah could see which choice he was going to make. It was written in the set of his jaw, the flush of his cheeks, the way his hands had curled into fists. He was going to choose pride over prudence, ego over intelligence. Poor bastard had no idea what he was walking into. "You think you can threaten me?" Donovan's voice was rising now, his control finally slipping completely. "You think you can come into my house and disrespect my Marines and walk away like you own the place?" Sarah's response was delivered with the kind of calm certainty that made smart people nervous and stupid people furious. "Sergeant, I don't think I can do anything. I know exactly what I can do. The question is whether you're smart enough to avoid finding out firsthand." The gauntlet was down. The lines were drawn, and Corporal Jake Thornton, still aching from his first lesson in humility, was about to watch his sergeant make the same mistake he had, assuming that confidence without competence was enough to win the day. The mess hall's atmosphere shifted like the air pressure before a tornado, that electric tension when everyone knows something catastrophic is about to happen but can't quite bring themselves to look away. Staff Sergeant Donovan stood in the center of it all, his authority challenged, his Marines watching, his entire worldview hanging in the balance of whatever happened in the next 60 seconds. What none of them knew, what they couldn't possibly know, was that 3,000 miles away in a nondescript office building in Langley, Virginia, a secure phone was ringing with the kind of urgency that made career intelligence officers reach for antacids. The call that would change everything was already in motion, triggered by facial recognition software that had identified Sarah Mitchell the moment she'd walked into the mess hall. But that revelation was still minutes away. For now, there was only the mounting tension and Donovan's fatal decision to mistake his local authority for universal dominance. "You know what I think?" Donovan said, his voice carrying the false confidence of a man who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. "I think you're some Pentagon bureaucrat who got lucky with a couple of self-defense moves. I think you're used to intimidating desk jockeys and paper pushers, and you figured you'd come slum it with the real military to see how the other half lives." He began circling her table like a predator marking territory, his movements calculated to demonstrate ownership of the space. Around the mess hall, Marines leaned forward in their chairs, sensing that their sergeant was about to restore the natural order of things. "See, lady, you made one critical error in judgment," Donovan continued. "You assumed that because you caught Thornton off guard, because you got in one lucky shot, that somehow makes you dangerous. But Thornton's just one Marine. I've got 37 more where he came from, and every single one of them would walk through fire for me." Sarah remained seated, her posture relaxed, hands folded calmly in her lap. To the casual observer, she looked like someone waiting for a bus, completely unconcerned with the growing aggression surrounding her. But Lance Corporal Cruz, watching from across the room, noticed something that made his blood run cold. Her eyes were constantly moving, cataloging positions, angles, distances. She was mapping the room like a chess player planning 6 moves ahead. "You want to know what's going to happen next?" Donovan's voice was gaining momentum, feeding off the attention of his audience. "You're going to apologize to Corporal Thornton for assaulting him. You're going to apologize to me for disrespecting my authority, and then you're going to walk out of here and never come back." He stopped directly in front of her table, leaning down to put his face level with hers. The gesture was pure intimidation, designed to make her feel small and vulnerable. What he saw in her eyes should have been his first warning that he'd made a terrible miscalculation. Sarah looked at him with the kind of clinical interest usually reserved for interesting bacteria under a microscope. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost conversational. "Sergeant, do you know what a kill box is?" The question came from nowhere, delivered with such matter-of-fact calm that it took a moment for anyone to process what she'd said. Donovan's aggressive posture faltered slightly, confusion flickering across his face. "What?" "A kill box," Sarah repeated, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. "It's a tactical term, refers to a predetermined area where you have complete fire superiority, where every angle is covered, where anything that enters becomes a target." She gestured casually around the mess hall, her movement encompassing the entire room. 37 Marines, all focused on this table, all potential combatants, all positioned where I can engage them sequentially without having to worry about crossfire or civilian casualties. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marines who'd been leaning forward eagerly began settling back in their chairs, survival instincts finally overriding entertainment value. Something was very wrong with this picture, and even the dumbest among them was beginning to sense it. "See, the thing about kill boxes," Sarah continued, her tone never changing from that eerily calm conversational register, "is that they work both ways. You can use superior position and numbers to trap an enemy or—" Her smile was absolutely arctic. "An enemy can use your assumptions about superiority to turn your own positions against you." Donovan's face was cycling through emotions like a traffic light with an electrical short. Confusion, anger, the first faint stirrings of something that might have been concern. Around the room, Marines were beginning to shift uncomfortably, phones still recording but hands moving closer to emergency contact numbers. "You're talking nonsense," Donovan said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried moments before. Kill boxes, fire superiority. What do you think this is, lady? Some kind of war zone? Sarah's laugh was soft, almost gentle, and somehow more terrifying than any threat could have been. Sergeant, you have no idea where you are right now. None of you do. You think you're in a mess hall on a secure military base, surrounded by fellow Marines, safe in your little bubble of institutional authority. She stood up from her chair, and the simple movement sent ripples of tension through the room, like a stone dropped in still water. Every Marine present felt their fight-or-flight instincts activate, though none of them could explain why. But you're not in a mess hall anymore, Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. You're in an evaluation zone. You're being tested, measured, assessed for fitness, and so far, every single one of you is failing. The words hit the assembled Marines like individual physical blows. Private First Class Sullivan felt his stomach drop as the implications began to sink in. Lance Corporal Cruz's hand moved instinctively toward his phone, suddenly desperate to delete the videos he'd been recording. Even Corporal Thornton, still nursing his injured arm, looked up with dawning horror. Evaluation? Donovan's voice cracked slightly. What kind of evaluation? Sarah pulled a slim leather wallet from her pocket, opened it with deliberate precision, and held it out where everyone could see. The identification card inside bore official seals, clearance levels, and a photograph that left no doubt about her identity. Commander Sarah Mitchell, SEAL Team 7, Naval Special Warfare Command, currently conducting a classified assessment of inter-service cooperation protocols and unit readiness for joint operations. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that followed explosions when the human ear was temporarily deafened and the world seemed to exist in perfect crystalline stillness. 37 Marines stared at the identification card with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters or car accidents. Staff Sergeant Donovan's face went through a transformation that would have been comical if the implications weren't so catastrophic. His ruddy complexion drained to the color of old parchment, his mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, and his eyes developed the 1,000-yard stare of a man watching his career evaporate in real time. "Commander," he whispered, the word coming out like a prayer from a condemned man. "That's correct, Sergeant." Sarah's voice remained level, professional, completely devoid of the satisfaction that lesser people might have shown at such a moment. "And for the past 43 minutes I've been observing and documenting the behavior, discipline, and professional conduct of Bravo Company." She looked around the room, making eye contact with Marines who suddenly couldn't bear to meet her gaze. Phones disappeared into pockets with lightning speed as the full scope of their situation became clear. "Corporal Thornton," she continued, her attention shifting to the man who'd started this entire catastrophe. "Assault on a superior officer, failure to verify identity before engaging, multiple violations of professional conduct standards." Thornton looked like he was going to be sick. His face had gone gray, and he was clutching his injured arm like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. "Lance Corporal Cruz, Private First Class Sullivan, recording and distributing unauthorized video of classified personnel without proper security protocols, potential violations of operational security." Both younger Marines looked like they wanted to disappear entirely, to somehow phase through the floor and emerge somewhere far away where their careers might still be salvageable. "And Sergeant Donovan," Sarah's attention returned to the man who'd orchestrated this disaster. "Failure to maintain unit discipline, failure to verify credentials of visiting personnel, creating a hostile environment for inter-service cooperation, threatening behavior toward superior officers." She closed her identification wallet and returned it to her pocket with careful precision. The assessment period is now concluded. I have more than sufficient documentation to complete my report to Naval Special Warfare Command and Marine Corps leadership. The implications hung in the air like toxic smoke. Everyone in the room understood what this meant: career-ending disciplinary action, courts-martial, dishonorable discharges, years of military service, training, and advancement destroyed by 43 minutes of spectacular stupidity. But Sarah wasn't finished with them yet. However, she said, and that single word carried more weight than anything else she'd spoken, assessments can be amended, depending on how the remaining evaluation period proceeds. A spark of hope flickered in Donovan's eyes, desperate and fragile. "Ma'am, if there's anything we can do to—" "There is," Sarah cut him off, "but it's going to require something that hasn't been much in evidence tonight. It's going to require you to listen, to learn, and to demonstrate that maybe, just maybe, you're capable of growing beyond your current limitations." She gestured toward the empty chairs around her table. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Sit down, Sergeant, all of you. It's time for the real lesson to begin." And as 37 Marines slowly, reluctantly, took seats around the woman they'd tried to intimidate, none of them had any idea that the hardest part of their education was still to come. The transformation that swept through Mess Hall, Charlie, was both immediate and profound, like watching a pack of wolves suddenly realize they were in the presence of an apex predator. 37 Marines who moments before had been confident in their superiority now moved with the careful deliberation of men walking through a minefield, every gesture calculated to avoid further catastrophe. Staff Sergeant Donovan lowered himself into the chair across from Sarah with the kind of rigid precision usually reserved for funeral ceremonies. His face had settled into a mask of professional neutrality, but she could see the panic flickering behind his eyes, the desperate calculation of a career military man trying to figure out how much of his future still existed. The other Marines followed suit, creating a rough semicircle around Sarah's table. Corporal Thornton moved gingerly, still favoring his injured arm, his earlier bravado replaced by the kind of hollow-eyed shock that followed traumatic revelations. Lance Corporal Cruz kept his hands carefully visible on the table, as if afraid that any sudden movement might trigger further consequences. Private First Class Sullivan looked like he was attending his own court-martial. Sarah let the silence stretch for exactly 30 seconds, watching their body language, cataloging the subtle tells that revealed their psychological states. Fear was good. Fear meant they were finally taking the situation seriously, but fear alone wasn't enough. What she needed was comprehension, the kind of deep understanding that would prevent them from making the same mistakes again. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the authority that came from a decade of leading men into combat, "we need to establish some ground rules for the remainder of this evaluation." She pulled out her notebook, the same one Thornton had dismissed as unimportant 43 minutes ago. Now it looked like the most dangerous document in the room, a record of failures that could end careers with a few strokes of a pen. First rule, honesty. I'm going to ask you questions, and you're going to answer them truthfully. Not what you think I want to hear, not what makes you look good, but the actual truth. Deception at this point would be inadvisable. Donovan nodded rapidly, probably more agreement than he'd shown in his entire military career. "Yes, ma'am. Understood." Second rule, respect. Not for me personally, I couldn't care less about your personal opinions, but for the process. This is a professional evaluation being conducted by a superior officer. You will conduct yourselves accordingly. More nods, more desperate agreement. Sarah could see the sweat beading on Sullivan's forehead despite the air conditioning. Third rule, learning. What happened here tonight wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable result of institutional failures that go much deeper than individual personality conflicts. If you want to salvage anything from this situation, you're going to need to understand how you got here. She opened her notebook to a fresh page, pen poised to document whatever came next. So let's start with the obvious question, Sergeant Donovan. When an unidentified individual enters your mess hall, what's the standard protocol? Donovan's military training kicked in automatically. Verification of identification and purpose, ma'am. Challenge credentials, escort to appropriate personnel if necessary. And what did you actually do? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Donovan's jaw worked as he searched for an answer that wouldn't sound like a complete admission of incompetence. We made assumptions, ma'am, based on appearance and preconceived notions about who belonged in our facility. Assumptions. Sarah wrote something in her notebook. What kind of assumptions, specifically? This was where it got dangerous. Sarah could see Donovan calculating, trying to figure out how much truth he could afford to tell without completely destroying himself. Ma'am, we assumed you were civilian personnel, contractor, maybe liaison, someone without operational authority. Why? The single word hit like a sniper's bullet, direct, precise, impossible to dodge. Donovan's face flushed as he realized there was no acceptable way to answer that question without acknowledging the sexism that had driven their behavior. Because, he started, stopped, tried again. Because we don't typically see female personnel in our operational areas. We made judgments based on incomplete information. Sarah's pen moved across the page with mechanical precision. Incomplete information, that's one way to put it. Corporal Thornton, do you agree with your sergeant's assessment? Thornton looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world, including several active war zones. Ma'am, Yes, ma'am, we made assumptions, wrong assumptions. Walk me through your decision-making process, Corporal. A woman enters your mess hall, sits alone, minds her own business. What made you think physical contact was appropriate? The question was surgical in its precision, designed to force Thornton to confront the ugliness of his own motivations. He squirmed in his chair like a suspect under interrogation. Ma'am, I thought she needed to understand her place, the hierarchy. I was trying to establish, to show dominance, Sarah finished for him. You were establishing dominance over someone you perceived as weak and therefore fair game for intimidation. The words hung in the air like a guilty verdict. Thornton couldn't meet her eyes, couldn't deny what they both knew was true. Lance Corporal Cruz, Sarah continued, turning her attention to the communications specialist. You recorded the encounter on your phone. What were you planning to do with that footage? Cruz's face went pale as he realized the implications of the question. Ma'am, it was just for entertainment. Maybe share it with some friends. Show them. Show them what? A woman being assaulted by Marines? A superior officer being attacked by subordinates? What exactly did you think would be entertaining about that? Each question was a precision strike, forcing them to confront not just their actions, but the mindset that had made those actions seem reasonable. Around the table, Marines who'd thought they were warriors were discovering they'd been nothing more than bullies with government-issued equipment. Here's what I see when I look at this unit, Sarah said, her voice cutting through their discomfort like a blade. I see institutionalized arrogance. I see a group of men so convinced of their own superiority that you've stopped questioning your assumptions, stopped verifying your intelligence, stopped following basic military protocols. She looked around the table, making eye contact with each man in turn. In a combat environment, that kind of thinking gets people killed. You see someone you don't recognize, You assume they're not a threat because they don't fit your preconceived notions. You fail to establish identity, fail to assess capabilities, fail to maintain situational awareness. Her pen moved across the page again. 6 months ago, a Marine patrol in Syria made similar assumptions about a woman they encountered at a checkpoint. She was small, appeared unarmed, didn't match their profile of a potential threat. They got sloppy with their protocols. The room went completely quiet. Everyone knew where this story was heading. The woman was wearing a suicide vest. 3 Marines died, 5 more were critically wounded. The investigation found that standard identification procedures had been ignored because the Marines made assumptions based on gender stereotypes. The silence that followed was deafening. Sullivan looked like he was going to be sick. Cruz was staring at his hands. Even Donovan seemed to have aged a decade in the past few minutes. That's the real world, gentlemen. That's what happens when you let prejudice override training. When you assume you know everything about a situation without gathering intelligence. Sarah closed her notebook with deliberate finality. So here's where we stand. I have documented evidence of multiple serious violations of military protocol and professional conduct. Under normal circumstances, this would result in immediate disciplinary action, potential courts-martial, and career-ending consequences for everyone involved. She let that sink in for a moment, watching the fear play across their faces. However, she continued, and that single word carried more weight than anything else she'd said, I'm prepared to consider this a learning opportunity rather than a disciplinary matter, but that consideration depends entirely on what happens next. Donovan leaned forward, desperation obvious in his voice. Ma'am, what do you need from us? How can we make this right? Sarah's smile was cold, but not entirely without mercy. You can start by proving that you're capable of learning from this experience, that you understand the fundamental failures that led to this situation, and that you're committed to ensuring it never happens again. She stood up from her chair, and every Marine in the room tensed reflexively. Tomorrow morning, 0500 hours, we're going to conduct a practical exercise, a test of your unit's actual capabilities versus your assumed superiority. You're going to have the opportunity to demonstrate whether tonight was an aberration or a symptom of deeper problems. Her gaze swept across the assembled Marines like a searchlight. I suggest you use the intervening hours wisely. Study your manuals, review your protocols, and think very carefully about the assumptions that brought you to this moment. She gathered her things with practiced efficiency, preparing to leave them with their failures and their fears. Oh, and gentlemen, she paused at the edge of their circle. Tomorrow's exercise will be evaluated by your commanding officer, your executive officer, and a representative from Marine Corps leadership. Your performance will determine not just your individual futures, but the future of this entire unit. With that, she walked away, leaving 37 Marines to contemplate the wreckage of their evening and wonder if they had any future left to salvage. The pre-dawn darkness at Marine Corps Base Oceanside carried a different quality than the oppressive tension of the previous evening. It was the kind of cold, clean darkness that preceded either triumph or disaster, where the outcome depended entirely on choices made in the crucible of pressure. At 04:45 hours, 37 Marines stood in formation on the parade ground, their breath visible in the morning chill, their futures hanging in the balance of whatever Commander Sarah Mitchell had planned for them. Staff Sergeant Donovan had spent the night in his quarters staring at the ceiling and calculating the damage to his career. He'd made phone calls, discreet inquiries to contacts in personnel, intelligence, anyone who might have information about Commander Mitchell and what kind of evaluation they were actually facing. The results had been uniformly terrifying. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just any SEAL. She was legend wrapped in classified operations, a ghost story that other special operators told in whispers. The fragments he'd managed to piece together painted a picture of someone who operated at levels so far above his experience that comparison was meaningless. 3 combat deployments in places that didn't officially exist. Missions that had never happened against targets that were never confirmed killed. A service record so heavily redacted that even the dates were classified. And now she was here, evaluating his unit, with the power to end not just careers, but the entire existence of Bravo Company. Corporal Thornton stood at attention in the second rank, his injured arm strapped and immobilized, but still throbbing with each heartbeat. The pain was nothing compared to the sick certainty that his military career was over. He'd assaulted a SEAL commander. There was no coming back from that, no amount of apologizing or explaining that could undo that level of catastrophic stupidity. His only hope was that whatever happened today might convince her to show mercy rather than destroy him completely. Lance Corporal Cruz and Private First Class Sullivan flanked him, both men pale and hollow-eyed from a sleepless night, spent deleting social media accounts, scrubbing phones, and trying to calculate how many years in military prison they might be facing for recording classified personnel without authorization. The irony wasn't lost on them. In trying to capture Sarah's humiliation for entertainment, they'd documented their own destruction in high definition. The formation was perfect, spacing exact, uniforms immaculate, weapons clean and ready. They'd spent 2 hours preparing, driven by the desperate hope that maybe, possibly, perfect execution of basic military standards might demonstrate their fitness for continued existence. It was a pathetic hope, but it was all they had. At precisely 0500 hours, 3 vehicles approached the parade ground. The first was a standard military sedan, black and official, flying command pennants that marked it as carrying senior leadership. The second was an identical vehicle that probably contained whoever was going to witness their professional execution. The third was different. A modified Humvee that looked like it had been designed for environments where failure meant death rather than embarrassment. The sedan doors opened first, disgorging Colonel James Harrison, the base commanding officer, and Major Patricia Vance, the executive officer. Both wore expressions that suggested they'd been briefed on the previous evening's events and were not pleased with what they'd learned. Harrison was a career Marine who'd earned his stars through competence rather than politics, and his face showed the kind of controlled fury reserved for subordinates who'd embarrassed the Corps through spectacular stupidity. The second sedan produced Brigadier General Robert Kane from Marine Corps headquarters at Quantico, his presence indicating just how seriously the chain of command was taking this evaluation. Kane was a legend in his own right, a warrior scholar who'd written doctrine on special operations integration while personally leading raids in 3 different theaters. If he was here, careers wouldn't just end. They'd be used as object lessons for future generations. But it was the third vehicle that commanded everyone's attention. Sarah Mitchell emerged from the modified Humvee, wearing full combat gear that looked like it had seen actual use rather than parade ground display. Her equipment was functional, well-maintained, and configured with the kind of attention to detail that marked someone who understood that gear failures in the field meant death rather than inconvenience. She carried herself with the same fluid confidence she'd demonstrated the night before, but now it was overlaid with something harder, more focused. This wasn't the woman who'd been trying to eat dinner in peace. This was a combat operator preparing to demonstrate the difference between real warriors and people who just played dress-up in military uniforms. "Gentlemen," Colonel Harrison's voice carried across the parade ground with the authority of absolute command. "You are about to participate in a practical evaluation designed to assess your unit's operational readiness and professional competence. This evaluation will be conducted by Commander Mitchell, observed by General Kane, and documented for review by Marine Corps leadership. He paused, letting the implications sink in. Every Marine present understood that this wasn't just an exercise, it was a trial, with their careers as the stakes. The scenario is simple, Harrison continued. Commander Mitchell represents a high-value target that has been located in hostile territory. Your mission is to capture or neutralize this target using appropriate tactics and procedures. You will have access to all standard equipment and support typically available for such operations. Sarah stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. Rules of engagement are as follows. I will be armed with simulation rounds and defensive equipment only. You will have full access to your combat loadout, including simulated weapons, communications, and support assets. The exercise area encompasses the entire training facility, approximately 4 square kilometers of varied terrain. She looked directly at Donovan, her green eyes holding no trace of the mercy she'd hinted at the night before. You have 15 minutes to plan your operation, organize your forces, and begin execution. I will give you a 5-minute head start before beginning evasion. Your objective is to locate, fix, and capture the target within 2 hours. General Kane stepped forward, his expression granite hard. Understand this, Marines. This is not a game. This is not a training exercise where everyone gets participation trophies. This is a practical demonstration of your capabilities, measured against genuine special operations standards. You will be evaluated on planning, execution, adaptability, and professional competence. He gestured toward the observation post that had been established at the edge of the training area. Your performance will be monitored, recorded, and analyzed by personnel with actual combat experience in similar operations. There will be no do-overs, no second chances, no excuses. Sarah checked her watch with military precision. 15 minutes, Marines. Use them wisely. Donovan felt the weight of command settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He had 15 minutes to plan an operation against a target that had already demonstrated superior tactical knowledge, physical capabilities, and operational experience. 15 minutes to prove that his unit deserved to continue existing. 15 minutes to salvage something from the wreckage of their careers. Form up, he called, his voice carrying more confidence than he felt. Squad leaders, on me. We need a plan. As his Marines gathered around him, Donovan caught a glimpse of Sarah in his peripheral vision. She was conducting her own equipment check with the kind of methodical thoroughness that marked someone who'd learned that overlooked details killed people. Her movements were economical, professional, and absolutely terrifying. All right, Donovan said, spreading a topographic map on the hood of the nearest vehicle. We're hunting a SEAL commander with unknown capabilities in 4 square kilometers of varied terrain. She knows we're coming, she's had time to plan, and she's already demonstrated that our assumptions about her are worthless. Thornton leaned over the map despite his injured arm. Sarge, she's one person. We're 37. Even with her training, the numbers are on our side. The numbers, Donovan said grimly, didn't help the 4 Marines she took apart last night. And those were close-quarters encounters where superior numbers should have mattered. He looked around at his squad leaders, seeing the same mixture of fear and determination in their faces that he felt in his gut. We need to think like hunters, not like bullies. We need to use our advantages, communications, coordination, local knowledge, while minimizing our exposure to hers. Cruz spoke up, his voice tight with nervous energy. What are her advantages, Sarge? What should we expect? Donovan studied the map, his tactical mind finally engaging with the kind of professional focus that had made him a staff sergeant. Superior individual skills, better environmental awareness, extensive experience in evasion and escape. She'll use the terrain, create multiple fallback positions, probably try to isolate us into smaller groups where she can engage on favorable terms. He began marking positions on the map with swift, confident strokes. We're going to set up overlapping search grids, maintain constant communication, and move in mutually supporting elements. No one operates alone, no one breaks radio protocol, and no one, absolutely no one, engages without backup. The plan that emerged was actually competent, a testament to the training and experience that had made Bravo Company a respected unit before their spectacular failure of judgment. Coordinated sweeps, overwatch positions, communication protocols that would prevent the kind of isolation tactics that special operators specialized in. But as Sarah Mitchell disappeared into the training area, with the fluid grace of a predator returning to its natural habitat, every Marine present wondered the same thing. Would competent planning be enough against someone who'd spent a decade turning warfare into an art form? The clock was ticking, and their education in humility was about to begin in earnest. The first 30 minutes of the exercise unfolded exactly as Staff Sergeant Donovan had feared it would. Despite his competent planning, despite the overlapping search grids and communication protocols, despite 37 Marines equipped with the finest military technology America could provide, Commander Sarah Mitchell had simply vanished into the 4 square kilometers of training area, like smoke dispersing in wind. The terrain worked against them in ways that their comfortable familiarity with the base had never prepared them for. What they'd thought of as home field advantage, knowing every building, every trail, every piece of cover, became a liability when facing someone who could read landscape like a tactical manual. Sarah understood that the Marines would rely on their knowledge of established paths and obvious positions, so she avoided anything that appeared on their maps or showed up in their standard patrol routes. Instead, she moved through spaces that existed in the gaps between their expectations, drainage ditches that connected buildings in ways the architects never intended, service tunnels that maintenance crews used but Marines ignored, elevated positions in the superstructure of training facilities that provided perfect overwatch of their movements while remaining invisible to ground-level observation. Corporal Thornton led Alpha Team through the eastern sector, his injured arm strapped tight but his determination burning white-hot. He'd convinced Donovan to let him participate despite his injury, arguing that sitting out would look like weakness to the observing officers. Now he was beginning to regret that decision as his team swept through empty buildings and found nothing but shadows and the growing certainty that they were being watched by someone infinitely more skilled than they were. "Contact front," came the whispered voice of Private Harrison over the radio, and every Marine in the exercise area felt their hearts skip. Building 7, second floor, movement in the southwest window. Thornton's team moved with professional efficiency toward the indicated position, weapons ready, communications crisp, execution flawless by any standard training manual. They established overwatch, cleared approaches, coordinated their entry with the kind of tactical precision that had taken years to develop. The building was empty, not just unoccupied, empty in the way that suggested no one had been there for hours. But in the southwest window, exactly where Harrison had reported movement, they found a small mirror positioned to catch sunlight and reflect it in ways that would create the impression of motion to observers at ground level. "She's playing with us," Thornton muttered into his radio, the realization bitter in his mouth. That wasn't a mistake or coincidence. She wanted us to find that. From the observation post, General Kane watched the tactical display with the kind of professional interest that marked someone who'd conducted similar operations in environments where failure carried more consequences than embarrassment. The electronic tracking system showed 37 Marines moving through predetermined patterns, while Sarah Mitchell's position remained completely unknown despite the sophisticated sensors designed to prevent exactly this kind of invisibility. "Impressive," he murmured to Colonel Harrison. "She's not just evading them, she's teaching them lessons they don't even realize they're learning yet." Harrison's expression was grim as he watched his Marines chase shadows. "Sir, how long do you think it'll take them to realize they're being systematically outmaneuvered?" "They already know," Kane replied. "The question is whether they're capable of adapting or if they'll keep repeating the same mistakes with increasing desperation." The answer came 20 minutes later when Lance Corporal Cruz's Bravo team reached the Central Communications Building and found their radio frequencies being jammed by equipment they couldn't locate but couldn't ignore. Sarah hadn't just disappeared, she was actively disrupting their coordination, turning their technological advantages into liabilities. "Comms are down," Cruz reported on the emergency backup channel, his voice tight with frustration. "Primary and secondary frequencies are getting white noise. Whatever she's using, it's sophisticated." Donovan felt the first cold touch of real fear settle in his stomach. The jamming wasn't random. It was targeted, precise, designed to fragment his force at exactly the moment when coordination was most critical. This was the kind of electronic warfare capability that special operations units used against high-value targets. And the fact that Sarah could deploy it solo suggested resources and training that went far beyond anything he'd imagined. "All teams, fall back to predetermined rally points," he ordered. "We're switching to visual signals and runner communication. Whatever game she's playing, we adapt." But adaptation required understanding your enemy's capabilities, and Sarah Mitchell was operating at levels that made prediction impossible. As Charlie team reached their rally point in the abandoned motor pool, they found that their predetermined position had been compromised in ways that demonstrated intimate knowledge of their planning process. Someone had moved their cached equipment, not stolen it, not destroyed it, moved it. The weapons, ammunition, and supplies they'd pre-positioned were now arranged in a perfect line 50 meters to the east, each item spaced with military precision, each placement a message that said, "I was here. I could have destroyed everything. I chose not to." Private First Class Sullivan stared at the rearranged equipment with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters. "How did she know where we'd hidden this stuff? We planned those positions after she'd already started the exercise." The answer, when it came, arrived in the form of a small note tucked under the radio they'd thought was secure. "Your planning session this morning was conducted in full view of Building 12's third-floor windows. Operational security includes visual as well as electronic measures. SM." The psychological impact was devastating. Sarah hadn't just outmaneuvered them physically. She'd been observing their preparation, listening to their plans, anticipating their moves before they'd even begun execution. Every advantage they thought they possessed had been an illusion. Every tactical decision had been made under the observation of someone who understood their capabilities better than they understood themselves. Donovan's voice crackled over the backup radio, tight with controlled desperation. "All teams acknowledge. We're being systematically dismantled. New plan, convergent search pattern. All teams move to Grid Square Tango 7. If she's watching us, we make her come to us." It was exactly the wrong decision, born of frustration rather than tactical thinking. By concentrating his forces, Donovan was giving Sarah exactly what she wanted. A target-rich environment where she could demonstrate the difference between special operations capability and conventional military training. Sarah watched the convergence from her position in an abandoned water tower that hadn't appeared on any of their maps. because it predated their survey data by 30 years. Through her scope, she could see 37 Marines moving with professional competence toward a position she'd been observing for the past 40 minutes. Their movements were textbook correct, their formation discipline excellent, their execution flawless by every standard they'd been trained to meet. They had no idea they were walking into a demonstration of why special operations existed as a separate discipline from conventional military training. The lesson was about to begin in earnest, and every Marine in the exercise area was about to discover that competence without understanding was just elaborate preparation for failure. Sarah checked her watch. 1 hour and 15 minutes remaining. Time enough to complete their education and, if they proved capable of learning, perhaps salvage something from the wreckage of their professional lives. She moved with the fluid silence that had made her a ghost in a dozen combat zones, beginning her descent from the water tower toward the convergence point where 37 Marines waited to learn the difference between playing soldier and being a warrior. The real tactical victory was about to begin. The convergence at Grid Square Tango 7 represented everything that was both magnificent and fatally flawed about conventional military thinking. 37 Marines moved into position with the kind of coordinated precision that made America's military the envy of the world. Overlapping fields of fire, mutually supporting positions, communication protocols that would have impressed any tactical instructor. They were competent, professional, and completely unprepared for what was about to happen to them. Staff Sergeant Donovan had chosen the position carefully. It was high ground with excellent visibility in all directions, multiple avenues of approach that his teams could cover, and natural obstacles that would channel any attack into predetermined kill zones. By every principle he'd learned in 20 years of military service, it was a perfect defensive position. The fact that it was also a perfect trap hadn't occurred to him, because traps required a level of tactical thinking that operated outside conventional doctrine. Sarah Mitchell observed their deployment from a concealed position 800 meters away, using optics that allowed her to catalog every weapon placement, every communication antenna, every detail of their defensive posture. The Marines had positioned themselves exactly as their training manuals dictated, which made their movements as predictable as clockwork to someone who understood how conventional forces thought. What they'd failed to consider was that their perfect defensive position was also perfectly isolated. The high ground that gave them visibility also made them visible. The natural obstacles that would channel attacks also prevented rapid withdrawal. Most critically, their concentration of forces created exactly the kind of target that Special Operations Doctrine was designed to exploit. Sarah keyed her radio to the frequency she knew they were monitoring, their secure backup channel that she'd been listening to since the exercise began. Her voice carried across the airwaves with the calm professionalism that had coordinated operations in places where mistakes were measured in body counts. Bravo, Company, this is your target. Excellent defensive positioning. Textbook execution of conventional tactics. Unfortunately, you're not facing a conventional threat. The words hit the assembled Marines like individual physical blows. Donovan felt his stomach drop as he realized that Sarah had been observing them, listening to their communications, probably tracking their movements since the moment they'd left the staging area. You have 30 seconds to consider your tactical situation before I begin my approach, Sarah continued. I suggest you use them wisely. 30 seconds to reconsider everything they thought they knew about warfare. 30 seconds to understand that their perfect position was actually a cage. 30 seconds to realize that they'd been outmaneuvered so completely that their surrender was probably the most tactically sound option available. Corporal Thornton, despite his injured arm, was the first to grasp the implications. Sarge, She's not coming at us. She's already here. She's been watching us set up this whole position. The realization spread through the defensive perimeter like wildfire. Marines who'd been confident in their superior numbers and positioning suddenly found themselves scanning shadows with the desperate intensity of men who'd realized they were prey rather than predators. "Movement 2 o'clock, called Private Harrison, his voice tight with adrenaline. "Tree line approximately 400 meters. Every weapon in the defensive perimeter swung toward the indicated position. 47 rifle scopes searched for the target that would validate their tactical superiority and restore their confidence in conventional military doctrine. The tree line was empty, had been empty for hours, but the report of movement had done exactly what Sarah intended. It had focused their attention in one direction while she approached from another. The smoke grenade that landed in the center of their position came from a direction no one was watching. It hit the ground with a metallic clank that every Marine recognized, rolled exactly 3 meters, and detonated in a hiss of white phosphorus that turned their perfect visibility into zero visibility in less than 5 seconds. "Contact! Contact!" Donovan's voice cut through the confusion as 37 Marines found themselves blind in the middle of their own defensive position. Training took over. They went prone, established interlocking fields of fire, tried to maintain unit cohesion despite the complete loss of visual reference. What happened next was a masterclass in special operations tactics, delivered to an audience that finally understood they were students rather than teachers. Sarah moved through the smoke with the kind of supernatural navigation that came from years of operating in environments where visibility was a luxury rather than a necessity. She used sound, air movement, even scent to build a 3-dimensional map of enemy positions while remaining completely invisible to their increasingly desperate searches. Her first target was Lance Corporal Cruz, who'd been designated as the communications coordinator. Sarah appeared beside him like a ghost, materializing from fog, one hand covering his mouth while the other disabled his radio with surgical precision. He tried to resist, tried to call for help, tried to bring his weapon to bear on a target that seemed to exist in several places simultaneously. The pressure point strike that rendered him unconscious was delivered with exactly enough force to incapacitate without causing permanent damage. Professional courtesy from someone who understood that this was education rather than execution. Cruz simply vanished from their communications net, his radio going dead mid-transmission in a way that told every Marine in the perimeter that something was systematically hunting them. Private First Class Sullivan was next. He'd been positioned as overwatch on the northern approach, confident in his marksmanship skills and the elevated position that gave him excellent fields of fire in 3 directions. He never saw Sarah coming because she didn't approach from any of the directions he was watching. Instead, she came from directly below, using the terrain features he'd dismissed as impassable to create an approach vector that existed outside his expectations. The combat knife that appeared at his throat wasn't there to kill, it was there to educate. Sarah's voice in his ear was calm, professional, completely without malice. "You're dead, Private. Your position was compromised the moment you chose elevation over concealment. In a real engagement, your body would be cooling while your teammates wondered why your sector went silent." Sullivan felt the knife withdraw, felt cable ties secure his hands, felt himself being positioned in a way that would prevent him from rejoining the fight. He wasn't injured, wasn't brutalized, just removed from the equation with the kind of efficiency that spoke of someone who'd done this in environments where the stakes were considerably higher than professional embarrassment. The psychological impact on the remaining Marines was devastating. 2 of their number had simply disappeared, picked off by a single operator who seemed to move through their defensive position like it didn't exist. Radio chatter became increasingly frantic as team leaders tried to maintain contact with subordinates who no longer existed in any tactical sense. "All teams, sound off," Donovan ordered, his voice carrying the kind of controlled desperation that marked a leader watching his command disintegrate in real time. "I need accountability on all personnel." The responses came back incomplete, fragmented, revealing gaps in their formation that spoke of systematic elimination rather than random contact. Sarah wasn't engaging them. She was dissecting them, removing their capability piece by piece while demonstrating the futility of conventional tactics against unconventional threats. Private Martinez found himself alone in what had been a mutually supporting position, his battle buddy gone without a trace, his radio crackling with increasingly desperate attempts at coordination. When Sarah materialized beside him, he actually felt relief rather than fear. At least the uncertainty was over. "You lasted longer than the others," Sarah said conversationally as she secured his weapon and applied the same cable tie restraints that had become her signature. "Good fieldcraft, excellent noise discipline. Your only mistake was trusting that conventional tactics would protect you from unconventional threats." She looked back toward the smoke-shrouded position where the remaining Marines were trying to organize a response to threats they couldn't see, predict, or counter. "The lesson isn't that you're incompetent," Sarah continued, her voice carrying just far enough for Martinez to hear. "The lesson is that competence without understanding is just elaborate preparation for failure. You're excellent Marines. You're just not special operations, and you're finally learning the difference." The smoke was beginning to clear, revealing the scope of what had happened in less than 10 minutes. 7 Marines eliminated without a shot fired, their defensive position compromised, their tactical superiority demonstrated to be an illusion. And somewhere in the remaining confusion, Sarah Mitchell continued to move like a ghost, completing their education one elimination at a time. The real lesson was just beginning, and every Marine still in the fight was about to discover that survival required more than following the manual. It required adaptation, innovation, and the humility to acknowledge when you were facing something beyond your current capabilities. The exercise was far from over, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. What remained was the question of whether these Marines could learn fast enough to salvage something from their systematic destruction. The smoke had completely dissipated by the time Staff Sergeant Donovan accepted the inevitable reality of his situation. 17 Marines remained from his original force of 37, scattered across what had been a perfect defensive position and was now revealed as an elaborate killing field. 20 of his men had been systematically eliminated in 43 minutes by a single operator who had turned their tactical superiority into a demonstration of their fundamental misunderstanding of modern warfare. Donovan stood in the center of the position, his weapon lowered, his radio silent. Around him, the remaining Marines maintained their defensive postures with the mechanical precision of men who knew they were going through motions rather than executing meaningful tactics. They could see their eliminated teammates secured with cable ties in various positions around the perimeter, alive, uninjured, but definitively removed from any tactical consideration. The psychological impact was complete. These Marines had trained for years to believe they were the apex predators of military combat. They'd completed tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, earned combat ribbons, survived firefights where their training and teamwork had kept them alive. But none of that experience had prepared them for an opponent who operated outside every tactical framework they understood. Sarah Mitchell emerged from concealment 50 meters to the east, moving with the same fluid confidence she'd demonstrated throughout the exercise. Her equipment showed no signs of the systematic elimination she'd just conducted. No scratches, no wear, no indication that she'd spent the better part of an hour dissecting a Marine platoon piece by piece. She walked toward the defensive position with her weapon lowered but ready, her bearing relaxed but alert. Every Marine still in the fight tracked her movement, but none raised their weapons. Training, honor, and the bitter recognition of complete tactical defeat kept them from actions that would have been meaningless anyway. "Exercise terminated," Sarah announced, her voice carrying clearly across the position. "All eliminated personnel may rejoin their units. Weapon status safe and secure." The Marines who'd been cable-tied began freeing themselves and retrieving their equipment, their movements subdued, professional but lacking the confident swagger that had characterized their deployment. They'd been given a lesson in humility that would reshape their understanding of their own capabilities for years to come. From the observation post, General Kane and Colonel Harrison approached with the measured pace of senior officers who'd witnessed something significant. Their expressions were carefully neutral, but both men carried themselves with the bearing of leaders who'd just watched their assumptions about military hierarchy challenged in fundamental ways. Donovan called his remaining Marines to formation, their response automatic despite the psychological battering they'd endured. The formation was perfect, spacing exact, posture military, discipline intact. But something essential had changed. The arrogance that had defined their unit culture had been systematically extracted and replaced with something harder to define but infinitely more valuable: respect for genuine competence. "Gentlemen," General Kane's voice carried the authority of 3 decades in uniform, "what you've just experienced was a practical demonstration of the difference between conventional military excellence and special operations capability. The gap between those two things is not a reflection of your worth as Marines. It's a recognition of specialized training, experience, and tactical thinking that operates at different levels." He gestured toward Sarah, who stood at relaxed attention, with the bearing of someone who'd completed a routine training exercise rather than a tactical masterpiece. "Commander Mitchell has just demonstrated why inter-service cooperation requires mutual respect rather than institutional prejudice. Why assumptions about capability based on appearance or gender or service branch can be not just wrong, but catastrophically wrong. Why professional military excellence demands constant learning rather than comfortable superiority." Colonel Harrison stepped forward, his expression serious but not unsympathetic. "Staff Sergeant Donovan, your tactical planning was competent, your execution was professional, and your leadership under pressure was exemplary, but you were facing an opponent whose capabilities exceeded your tactical framework. That's not a failure of character. It's a limitation of experience." Donovan felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the terror that had gripped him since the previous evening. This wasn't complete destruction, this was education. Painful, humiliating, but ultimately constructive education delivered by someone who could have destroyed them entirely, but had chosen instruction over annihilation. "Ma'am," Donovan addressed Sarah directly, his voice carrying genuine respect rather than the forced deference that had characterized their earlier interaction. "Permission to speak freely?" Sarah nodded, her expression neutral but attentive. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology, not just for last night, but for everything that led to last night, for the assumptions, the prejudice, the institutional arrogance that made us treat you as less than the professional you obviously are." He looked around at his Marines, seeing nods of agreement rather than the resentment he'd expected. "We've learned something here that we should have known already, that competence has nothing to do with gender, service branch, or preconceived notions about who belongs where. You demonstrated capabilities that exceed anything we've encountered, and you did it while teaching rather than destroying. Corporal Thornton stepped forward, his injured arm still strapped but his bearing steady. Ma'am, I need to apologize as well. For grabbing you, for disrespecting you, for assuming I knew what I was dealing with. You had every right to end my career, but you gave me a chance to learn instead. I won't forget that. One by one, the Marines stepped forward to acknowledge their failures and express gratitude for lessons that had been delivered with violence, calibrated to educate rather than punish. It was a transformation that spoke to the fundamental character of men who'd been wrong but weren't too proud to acknowledge it when confronted with overwhelming evidence. Sarah listened to each apology with the same professional attention she'd given to their tactical movements. When the last Marine had spoken, she addressed the formation with the authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak truth to power. Marines, you are not failures. You are conventional forces who discovered the limitations of conventional thinking. The solution isn't to become special operations. It's to become better Marines. More humble, more adaptable, more willing to question your assumptions. She gestured toward the training area where they'd been systematically dismantled. What happened here wasn't about superior individual capability. It was about understanding your strengths and limitations, using appropriate tactics for the specific threat, maintaining operational security, and never assuming you know everything about your enemy. Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd learned these lessons in environments where failure meant death rather than embarrassment. The Marine Corps is an excellent institution that produces excellent warriors. But excellence requires constant growth, constant learning, constant willingness to be wrong so you can become right. General Kane stepped forward, his expression serious but not condemnatory. Staff Sergeant Donovan, your unit will undergo additional training in inter-service cooperation, cultural sensitivity, and tactical adaptation. This will not be recorded as a disciplinary action, but as a professional development opportunity. The relief that washed over the formation was visible, but it was tempered by the understanding that they'd been given a gift, the chance to learn from catastrophic mistakes without catastrophic consequences. Sarah checked her watch with military precision. The formal evaluation is complete. However, I'll be remaining on base for the next 3 days to conduct integration training. You'll have the opportunity to learn some of the techniques you experienced today, to understand how special operations thinking can enhance conventional capabilities. She looked around the formation, making eye contact with each Marine in turn. Who you were last night doesn't define who you can become. But that growth requires you to check your egos at the door and approach this as students rather than teachers. As the formation dispersed and Marines began the process of understanding what had happened to them, Sarah Mitchell stood alone for a moment in the morning sun. She'd accomplished her mission, not the official evaluation, but the harder task of transforming institutional arrogance into institutional learning. The real victory wasn't tactical, it was psychological. 37 Marines who'd walked into this exercise convinced of their superiority were walking out with something far more valuable. The understanding that true strength came from acknowledging weakness and growing beyond it. The transformation was complete. What remained was to see whether the lessons would stick when the immediate shock wore off and comfortable old attitudes reasserted themselves. But for now, for this moment, progress had been made in the endless battle to make good warriors into better ones. 3 months after the exercise that had redefined Bravo Company's understanding of military excellence, Marine Corps Base Oceanside hummed with a different energy. The changes weren't immediately visible to casual observers. The same Marines walked the same paths, conducted the same training exercises, maintained the same equipment with the same meticulous attention to detail that had always characterized the Corps. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted in ways that would ripple through military culture for years to come. Staff Sergeant Donovan sat in his office, reviewing after-action reports from the latest joint training exercise, his expression one of quiet satisfaction rather than the defensive arrogance that had once defined his leadership style. The reports painted a picture of a unit that had transformed failure into growth, humiliation into wisdom, defeat into a kind of victory that couldn't be measured in conventional terms. Bravo Company had become something unprecedented in Marine Corps culture, a conventional unit that understood the value of unconventional thinking. Their tactical procedures now included protocols for engaging threats that operated outside traditional military frameworks. Their training emphasized adaptability over adherence to doctrine. Most importantly, their culture had evolved from one of institutional superiority to one of professional humility. The transformation had begun with individual conversations that extended far into the night, Marines struggling to reconcile their self-image as elite warriors with the reality of their systematic defeat. But rather than breaking their spirit, the experience had refined it, stripped away the arrogance that had made them vulnerable, and replaced it with the kind of quiet confidence that came from truly understanding one's capabilities and limitations. Corporal Jake Thornton knocked on the office door, his bearing professional but relaxed. The injury, too. His arm had healed completely, but the psychological wound to his ego had healed into something stronger and more valuable, genuine respect for competence regardless of its source. "Sarge, the new integration protocols are working," Thornton reported, his voice carrying genuine enthusiasm rather than the performative bravado that had once characterized his communication. The joint exercise with SEAL Team 7 went flawlessly. No friction, no territorial disputes, perfect cooperation. Donovan nodded, unsurprised but pleased. The integration training that Sarah Mitchell had conducted over 3 intensive days had fundamentally altered how his Marines approached inter-service cooperation. They'd learned to see other military branches not as rivals to be dominated, but as resources to be leveraged, each with specialized capabilities that enhanced overall mission effectiveness. "How's morale holding up?" Donovan asked, though he could see the answer in Thornton's demeanor. The toxic masculinity that had once poisoned unit culture had been replaced by something healthier, pride based on actual accomplishment rather than perceived superiority. "Better than ever, honestly," Thornton replied. "The men know they're part of something special now, not because we think we're better than everyone else, but because we've learned to be better than we were." It was a profound distinction that spoke to the psychological transformation that had occurred. These Marines had discovered that true elite status came not from looking down on others, but from constantly reaching higher standards themselves. Lance Corporal Cruz appeared in the doorway, his expression eager rather than the desperately needy validation-seeking that had once defined his personality. "Sarge, permission to speak freely about the new recruits?" "Granted. Sir, they're different. The new Marines coming into the unit, they've heard about what happened here, about the changes we made. They're arriving with better attitudes, more openness to learning. It's like word got out that Bravo Company is where you go to actually grow as a Marine." This was perhaps the most significant indicator of long-term change. Military culture was notoriously resistant to reform, but when change occurred authentically, driven by genuine transformation rather than imposed mandate, it could spread through the ranks with viral efficiency. Private First Class Sullivan, now a full corporal and team leader in his own right, had become the unit's unofficial ambassador for the new culture. His natural enthusiasm, tempered by hard-won wisdom, made him uniquely qualified to help new Marines understand that strength and humility weren't contradictory concepts. The training protocols Commander Mitchell established are being adopted at other bases, Sullivan reported during the weekly leadership meeting. Quantico wants us to send instructors to teach integration techniques to other units. We're becoming the model for how conventional and special operations forces can work together. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The unit that had spectacularly failed at inter-service cooperation was now teaching other Marines how to do it properly. But the irony was grounded in genuine transformation rather than bureaucratic rhetoric. Colonel Harrison had made multiple visits to observe the changes in Bravo Company, each time coming away more impressed with what authentic leadership development could accomplish when divorced from ego protection and institutional politics. The unit's performance metrics had improved across every measurable category, but more importantly, their approach to challenges had fundamentally shifted. Where they'd once met obstacles with overwhelming force, they now approached problems with systematic analysis. Where they'd once assumed superior capability, they now assessed actual capabilities against specific requirements. Where they'd once dismissed outside perspectives, they now actively sought diverse viewpoints that could enhance their understanding. The most visible symbol of this transformation was the photograph that now hung in the unit's common area. It showed Commander Sarah Mitchell standing with the 37 Marines of Bravo Company, taken on the final day of her integration training. But unlike typical military photographs with their rigid formality, this image captured something more human, genuine respect between professionals who'd learned to value competence over convention. Sarah herself had moved on to other assignments, other units that needed the same kind of transformative education that Bravo Company had received. But her influence remained in the form of training protocols, tactical procedures, and most importantly, a cultural shift that had made these Marines better at their jobs and better as human beings. The ripple effects extended beyond military effectiveness. The Marines of Bravo Company had learned lessons about prejudice, assumption, and the danger of institutional arrogance that applied to every aspect of their lives. They returned to their communities as better citizens, better leaders, better examples of what military service could produce when done right. General Kane had included the Bravo Company transformation in his report to the Joint Chiefs of Staff as a case study in authentic military cultural change. The report noted that sustainable improvement in military effectiveness required more than new equipment or revised doctrine. It required the kind of psychological transformation that could only occur when units were willing to confront their failures honestly and grow from them. As the afternoon sun set over Marine Corps Base Oceanside, Staff Sergeant Donovan walked through the training areas where his Marines continued their preparation for whatever challenges lay ahead. Their movements were crisp, professional, confident, but the confidence was grounded in reality rather than illusion. They'd learned that true military excellence wasn't about dominating others, but about mastering themselves. They'd discovered that strength wasn't diminished by acknowledging weakness, but enhanced by addressing it. Most importantly, they'd realized that the best warriors weren't those who never failed, but those who learned from failure and became stronger because of it. The transformation was complete, but it was also ongoing. Every day brought new opportunities to apply the lessons they'd learned, to demonstrate that growth was possible, even for institutions as tradition-bound as the military. They'd become living proof that change was possible when approached with honesty, humility, and the courage to admit that there was always more to learn. In the end, Commander Sarah Mitchell had given them something more valuable than tactical knowledge or professional skills. She'd given them the understanding that true strength came not from never being beaten, but from getting back up better than before. The Marines of Bravo Company had been broken and rebuilt, humbled and elevated, defeated and ultimately victorious, in ways they never could have imagined when their journey began with a simple grab for a ponytail in a mess hall that seemed like a lifetime ago. They were still Marines, but now they were Marines who understood what that title truly meant and what it demanded of those worthy to carry it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.